My semester project is on Ronald Reagan. He was the 40th President of the United States. He was a Republican, and he held office from 1981 to 1989. The book that I used to do my semester project is Reagan the Life by H.W. Brands. It's a book of about 800 pages. It's organized into 7 sections. Sections 1, 2, and 3 are Reagan before his presidency, 4, 5, and 6 are Reagan during his presidency, and Section 7 is Reagan after his presidency to his death in 2004. Reagan the Life is very factual and is very detail-oriented. However, it does read like a novel. H.W. Brands himself is very objective in the biography. However, he does include a lot of opinions from different professionals in the political field. Sections 1 through 3 of the book are actually pretty short in comparison to the rest of the book, but they do go into a lot of detail about Reagan's life before the presidency. Some key points are as follows. Reagan was born to a working-class family in Iowa in 1911. His father was an alcoholic and traveled a lot, and as a result, his family traveled a lot, so Reagan had to attend very many schools as a child. Reagan said at one point that he had attended 4 different schools in 4 years, and as a result, he fell behind in a lot of his academics and in his social skills. Reagan didn't become the social butterfly that we all know him as until high school when he joined his school's theater program. It was here that Reagan found his love for theater and developed all of the charm and charisma that we know of him in his presidency. After graduating from high school, Reagan attended Eureka College. Here he became very active in student politics, becoming student body president and leading protests on campus. Reagan didn't go into politics after leaving college, though. He became a radio announcer for the Chicago Cubs after leaving school and was signed by Warner Brothers in 1937, which is where his acting career kicked off. Reagan's acting career spanned 3 decades, all the way to 1965 when he decided to retire and go into a career in politics. Ronald Reagan was the first president to be in the public eye this way. No other president up until Donald Trump had been in the entertainment business as long as Reagan had and with the popularity that he had. Ronald Reagan is remembered as a president who didn't have much political experience before holding office as president. However, Reagan did serve 2 terms as the governor of California, which is a big part of the reason that he won the presidency in the first place. Reagan's interest in politics started well before his actual political career started, and he used his stature as an actor to actually work on other presidential campaigns. The most notable campaign that Reagan worked on was the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964, and obviously we know that Goldwater didn't actually win the presidency, but this is where many voters expressed interest in Reagan running for office with his A Time for Choosing speech. While Reagan didn't really do anything revolutionary as the governor of California, it's worth pointing out that he was much more liberal and progressive as the governor of California than he was as the president of the United States. He actually became much more conservative during his terms as governor than he was when he was elected governor. I also will touch on this later in the presentation, but I just thought it was worth pointing out the similarities between the Reagan-Bush campaign and the Trump campaign in 2016. As you can see, their slogans were almost exactly the same. Reagan actually ran for governor once before 1980, but he didn't win the Republican Party nomination. But in 1980, his campaign promises included lowering federal taxes, less government interference on the individual level, increased states' rights, and a strong national defense, considering this was the time of the Cold War. It's also important to note that Jimmy Carter's approval ratings at this time were pretty low considering other presidents around this time. So this was a pretty unique opportunity for a Republican to win the election, even though it was only after Jimmy's first term. Once Reagan is actually sworn into office, it doesn't take him long, just like any other president, to start acting on his campaign promises. I've split this presentation up based on the kind of policy that he enacted, and the first I'm going to go over is social policy. One of Reagan's longest-lasting social policies is the war on drugs. You probably have heard of the war on drugs. We still talk about it today. It's still very active today. Reagan didn't actually begin the war on drugs. It was started by President Richard Nixon. However, Nixon didn't really gain the traction that Reagan did with his efforts in the war on drugs. The war on drugs sought to eliminate drugs from American streets, and most of this was done by incarceration. Reagan actually enacted mandatory minimums. He was the first president to do so, which is why we still have them today. As of today, our government has spent more than $1 trillion on the war on drugs, and we're actually starting to walk back on some of those policies. Many states have legalized or decriminalized some drugs, and a lot of states are letting out people who are put in prison for drug offenses. Another social policy that Reagan dealt with, which he actually is known for inaction for, is the AIDS epidemic. A lot of people have the belief that Reagan didn't really do anything for the AIDS epidemic, but compared to previous administrations, even though the AIDS epidemic was already present, Reagan actually did much for the AIDS epidemic and raised a lot of money in the federal government for those resources. Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. She was the first woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court, so that is something definitely worth noting. Something also worth noting is Reagan's stance on civil rights legislation. There was actually a lot of civil rights legislation passed by the federal government during this time, but Reagan supported almost none of it. However, his vetoes were often overridden by Congress because there was overwhelming support for such legislation in Congress. Reagan wanted to appeal to his Southern Democratic and all-around Republican base, and most of those people during this time did not want to go forward with civil rights legislation. I'm not going to go too in detail with the international policy that Reagan enacted while he was president. However, it's worth noting that he was much more aggressive than previous administrations on international issues, mainly the Cold War and the Soviet Union. The Carter administration was much more focused on negotiations than the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration thought there was much less leeway for America to give, and that it was the Soviet Union's job to step up and solve this issue. Reagan was more willing than Carter to be offensive toward the Soviet Union. He called them the evil empire, which, less than being offensive, was just more of an act of aggression, which pointed to Reagan not believing in negotiation and believing that the American cause was the right one. Reagan's international policy was very controversial. It upset a lot of people, especially some of our allies, and it did increase tensions in the Cold War. However, nuclear war didn't happen, so I would say, I guess we're okay. Now, of course, we have to talk about Reaganomics, and it's something I am not happy to talk about. Reagan's economic policy made a sweeping change to the way that the federal government worked and the way that taxes worked in the federal government. Up to this point, the economy was not doing great, inflation was running rampant, and a lot of people were unemployed. 7 million people were unemployed at the time that Reagan took office. Reagan's biggest change was through trickle-down economic theory, which, in its simplest terms, sought to bring tax cuts to the rich in order to stimulate the economy. These tax cuts were not supported by everyone and still aren't supported by everyone. However, the tax cuts still remain, and taxes in the federal government are nothing like they were before Reagan took office, even today. As far as Reagan's overall performance as president, he wasn't the greatest, he wasn't the worst. He didn't do many progressive things for civil rights or feminist movements. In fact, he regressed the country in a lot of ways, and he validated a lot of far-right movements that undo civil rights legislation and gender equality legislation. My opinion is a little biased. I don't think that Reagan was a good president. I don't think he was the worst president we've ever had, but he did definitely leave some negative lasting effects on the presidency and on the American economy. It's also very worth noting that Reagan lowered the standard of political experience for candidates, which on its own isn't a bad thing, but Reagan's presidency is almost to a T all of the things that validated Donald Trump's presidency. Reagan revamped and validated the conservative far-right movement that we see today. He also just forced us to look more critically at our federal government in a way we had not been in previous administrations. Overall, many of Reagan's actions as president were necessary. However, many of them left more lasting negative impacts than positive ones. That is my total review of Ronald Reagan as the 40th President of the United States. Thank you for listening.